por el valor de la discusión, por el bien de la discusión, considera lo que digo. La mayoría de la gente, al menos de este país, tiene poca idea si lo que estoy diciendo es la verdad o no. Pueden decir que soy un loco, o que soy un idiota, o mucho peor, pero estoy dando información, mientras ellos dan solo sentimientos. Escucha, como un italiano y así un latino, una persona del nido de la cultura latina, entiendo muy bien cuánto importan los sentimientos, pero no al costo de la verdad. Y me imagino que el resto de la gente tiene idea, o supongo. Pueden tener comprensión o conocimiento, pero simplemente no les importa mucho, porque es contrario a la narrativa de la política de identidad que han adoptado. Y la verdad, I think a great example of sort of this cultural confusion, this mix of a willingness to celebrate a particular heritage while refusing to acknowledge the reality of that same heritage culpability is in Robert Rodríguez's Mariachi trilogy, or at least the last 2/3 of it starring Antonio Banderas. Antonio Banderas is from Spain. He is a white European of the people who are Latin Americans' imperialist, slave-driving ancestors. And here is a white European cast as a Mexican who somehow is seen as part of the family, so to speak, because he obviously speaks the same language as the people in this hemisphere who suffered at his people's imperialism. He is of the people that are the ancestors of Spanish Americans. But at the same time, liberal America that has a problem with people of a particular white European culture portraying people who are not necessarily or at all white, have no problem with Antonio Banderas getting a great tan to play the part of a Mexican. Now I think Alfonso Cuaron is a wonderful example of someone who is comprehensive and knowledgeable and understanding of this confluence of culture. He is a Mexican person who, for instance, in his motion picture Roma, shows the multi-dimensional aspect of culture in exactly the way that I've been describing. That they are all Mexican, but obviously his family, which is depicted in the motion picture, are white, predominantly white, European Mexicans who obviously are more biologically, for lack of a better word maybe, in terms of heritage and in terms of actual DNA, connected to the Spanish imperialist ancestors of Mexico. And the housekeeper, who obviously is more of an indigenous heritage, Native American, be it Aztec or any other specifically Mexica heritage predating Columbus, is different, and yet they're all Mexican. And that's a motion picture, that's an artist, a filmmaker, a Latin American person, Alfonso Cuaron, who does understand, assume, and present culpability for the virtuous and the vile aspects inherent with his Latin American culture. Those who celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day sort of as a protest against Columbus Day, instead of Columbus Day, I imagine embrace Latino Heritage Month the month before. But it's Latino heritage that committed genocide against the indigenous people. It's Latino heritage that invented the transatlantic slave trade. It's Latino heritage that invented the caste system in this hemisphere. All of which basically invented racism, which we unfortunately still struggle with today. Somehow all the blame gets assigned to the British and the descendants of the British, while the descendants of the Spanish, Hispanic Americans, assume by and large no culpability for that whatsoever. Cristoforo Colombo was the driver. The Spanish state, Spanish culture, Spanish heritage were the other three guys in the car who planned the robbery, who got out and robbed the bank, and then fired the driver, and then robbed the bank for the next 500 years. And yet all the culpability for the robbery is placed at the feet of the driver. September, during Latino Heritage Month, the legacy of the robbers in the car is venerated. And come October, the driver is vilified. Columbus led the Europeans, and even though they weren't on the ships with him, the Africans and the Asians, to the discovery that continents existed on this earth that they did not know of, and to the discovery on the part of the Native Americans that Europeans existed. The Spanish took this as the opportunity to expand their empire through colonialism, through genocide, through the invention and execution of the transatlantic slave trade. This was Spanish invention, Spanish architecture, Spanish execution, i.e., Latinidad. That particular aspect of Latinitas, from the indigenous Latin, or as Italians would say, Latino, Latinita in Italia. I'm a fan of the New York Yankees, of the proliferation of democracy, of bachata, and of sancocho. I am fully aware, able, and willing to understand that the New York Yankees and the proliferation of democracy thanks to the United States is also part and parcel with the Anglo heritage of this country that was also culpable for genocide, for the proliferation of slavery in this country. I don't have a problem acknowledging all of that and understanding that with those atrocities also came good things, democracy, the Yankees, or whatever aspect of American culture you enjoy or consume, even as a liberal who rightly finds egregious all the bad aspects of that Anglo heritage and legacy. Now, if you enjoy, as I do, bachata and sancocho, you have to understand that those good aspects of Latin American culture are also part and parcel with the history and the heritage of Latin culture in this hemisphere that is also responsible, not only responsible, but were the inventors and initiators of genocide of the indigenous, of slavery of the African in America, of the caste system. And yet somehow there is by and large allowed a disassociation of Latin heritage from those horrendous things for which it is culpable. Now, not only is that culpability assigned squarely to the Anglos, but it's also assigned to every other European ethnicity that is lumped in to Anglo culture, who are not Anglos. You know, Malcolm X's grandmother was half Anglo because her mother, who was African, probably a slave, was raped by an Anglo man. That's why Malcolm X was so light-skinned. Malcolm X was not going to go around thumping his chest for Anglo heritage because he's the descendant of an Anglo rapist. I had a classmate in college who was African American, but who also had a grandparent who was a white Brit from England. And she was an Anglophile. She embraced all aspects of her heritage or heritages. She was a proud Black American. She was a proud African American. And she was a proud Anglo-American. She did not deny the totality and scope of her heritage. She didn't need a history lesson in the culpability of her Anglo heritage for the atrocities by which her African heritage was enslaved. And I don't mean to appear bullying or single out Latino heritage. I embrace Latino heritage. God willing, my children are going to be Hispanic. But unlike my classmate, there's by and large, whether you're Hispanic, whether you are a liberal American of any other color, or a creed. I feel there's by and large an inability to acknowledge the full scope that comes with that heritage, the bad and the good. It's squarely placed at the feet of Columbus. I am perfectly willing and an advocate for acknowledging any and all atrocities that happened in this hemisphere as a result of European imperialism. Let's talk about it. I'm not going to bullshit any issue. But I feel that a lot of people who claim to want to do the same thing, to have the same conversations, don't realize how much they end up scapegoating Columbus for the nature of Spanish imperialism, Spanish culture, Spanish heritage. Now, I know that insinuating the scapegoating of Columbus is a hell of a thing to say. I don't mean to dismiss or justify whatever atrocities he was at the forefront of, but how about we have more understanding? How about we have deeper understanding, deeper knowledge, instead of less? How about we don't cherry pick? But now you can't upstage Dad. Okay. Down. Good boy. I love you. We Italians are the only indigenously Latin people on earth. Or as we would say in Italian, Latino. Feelings and what is normative in popular culture for the past 60 years has no bearing on the fact that 4,000 years before Columbus, 4,000 years before there was a single Latin American on this planet, there was an indigenous Italian tribe called the Latin people that led to their creation of the city of Rome, which was a Latin civilization. A civilization that made Spain Latin. Or the fact that in post-Roman Italia, medieval and Renaissance Italia, that this was still a Latin civilization, though no longer Roman, that called itself Latin, and in its own language, Latino. At that point, even after Rome, a millennium before Columbus, before there was a single Latin American on this planet. Or the fact that Italians in Italia today know perfectly well that they are Latin, or as they still say today, Latino. Italia is the nest and the cradle of la cultura latina, as we would say in Italian. Feelings and popular culture don't change that truth. Yet for the past 60 years or so, we have been disassociated from that fact to the point of exclusion in this hemisphere from the acknowledgement of what has been our indigenous culture for 5,000 years and running. Now, that wasn't always so. That's a relatively recent phenomenon, I would say sort of in the last 60 years. And it's funny, in Boots Riley's motion picture, Sorry to Bother You, he has a character ask, how long have Italians been white? And another character answers, well, about 60 years. Now, color is arbitrary, okay? What certainly has been lost in the last 60 years, or neglected, or refused, or set aside in the last 60 years in American popular culture is the fact that Italians are Latin. And if you look at popular culture in this hemisphere, until, say, the 1960s, you have instances, for instance, in Sports Illustrated, even as late as the 1950s, them showing the newest Italian sports cars, the newest Italian racing cars, and they'll describe them as the newest Latin specs, the newest Latin sensibilities towards the racing car. Or in Murder on the Orient Express in the 1930s, they are all suspicious of the Italian on board as the murderer, who ironically in the recent movie a couple years ago was replaced by a Spanish person. But they refer to the Italian character as acting Latin in the extreme, which he was. He was Latin in the midst of what was an Anglo narrative. Or in motion pictures, in movies of the 30s, 40s, they'll say, well, the suspect looked Latin. So, okay, he was Latin. Let's round up the Italians, the Spanish, and the French. Rightly so, the French who are also Latin. And I imagine that the first sort of major break, disassociation of Latin America or Latin Americans with the notion of the Spanish being not just their colonizers, but their own ancestors, might have been in the wake of the Spanish-American War. You're talking around the turn of the 20th century, 1898 or so, which was sort of the event that sealed the deal for Latin America disassociating itself from Spain in the way that Anglo-America had done over 100 years before, obviously with the American Revolution. And yet I find that it's still the cherry picking of association and disassociation. Latin Americans, Spanish Americans who kicked out Spain, who disassociated themselves from Spain, but will call themselves Spanish. Anglo-Americans, who obviously kicked out England, don't refer to themselves as English. So Hispanic Americans call themselves Spanish, even though they kicked out the Spanish, but disassociate themselves from the crimes and atrocities in this hemisphere inherent in Spanish culture. The cherry picking of heritage that we venerate and hold culpable for atrocities. And come the 1960s, I think that a lot of it was due to the proliferation now of Latin Americans in sports, for instance, in baseball, whereas previously they may have been excluded for racist reasons. Now the proliferation of specifically Latin American, Spanish American athletes in sports and other aspects of popular culture, the floodgates being open now, where before it may have been more drip drip, frankly for prejudicial reasons, for racist reasons, now enabled the popular acknowledgement, rightly so, of their presence in our popular culture. The Juan Marichals, the Minnie Miñosos, the Orlando Cepedas, just for instance. Whereas before that, it was a little rare, and they even had to straddle the fence, Latin American athletes and ball players, as to whether or not they're black or European. Because blacks were not allowed. They were banned, obviously. And that's a straddling that came inherent with the Pan-American situation, an argument of ethnicity and race that is inherent in American culture. And now you had Italians sort of being lumped in with the Anglos and not that which was specifically Latin. So maybe in the first half of the career of a Joe DiMaggio, there may be a journalist or a sports writer who maybe refers to him being Latin. But come the second half of his career, or certainly 10, 15 years after his career ended in the 60s, he's not going to be referred to Latin anymore. Where someone like, say, the first openly out Italian to play, a Tony Lazzeri, who was also on the Yankees, but a decade or a decade and a half before Joe DiMaggio, he wasn't going to be lumped in with the Anglos by any means. And you would have more of a tendency to acknowledge his Latin heritage. So it was in very short order, the last 60 years or so, in which Italians have been disassociated from their 5 millennia long and counting heritage as Latin people, while still being appropriated at will by the rest of this hemisphere. In terms of food, in terms of style, in terms of the Latin roots of their own language, how there is permitted such a sweeping normalization and justification of the appropriation of one culture by another is beyond me. How there is permitted such a disconnect between another culture's pride in their Latinidad and that culture's culpability for the atrocities of this hemisphere is beyond me. I think this often comes from an activism that I believe in, that aims for more understanding, more comprehension, more knowledge of culture and of history, but that may often be led by people who aren't necessarily knowledgeable or comprehensive or understanding of the totality of history and of culture, or who don't necessarily have the courage of their convictions to constantly learn and widen the scope of their embrace of an understanding of culture if it goes against the grain of what they've deemed as the summation of their learning. I welcome Columbus Day as an opportunity of the re-examination of Pan-Americanism, the re-examination of all of us in this hemisphere, all of our shared heritage of atrocity, of the wonderful aspects of culture, both Latin and Anglo, that blossomed often because of atrocity. And that includes the culpability that Anglos and Latins both share for the atrocities that planted the seeds for both Anglo heritage and Latin heritage to proliferate in this hemisphere. Do we actually care about indigenous cultures? Or do we cherry pick? Do we actually have a problem with the appropriation of cultures? Or do we cherry pick? Do we all have the courage of our convictions to call out bullshit, to assume culpability, and to try to achieve atonement to the extent that we may? Or do we cherry pick? I think what Columbus Day is the epitome of is our need for more understanding, more knowledge, more comprehensiveness of history and culture, regardless of how inconvenient all of that may be.